somewhere on the planet, in a single 7-day span, buried deep in the archaeological record, entire communities on 3 separate continents stopped leaving evidence of themselves, not slowly, not over a generation, within days of each other. By the best radiocarbon windows we have, cooking fires went cold, looms sat midweave, and doorways were never crossed again. Archaeologists do not agree on why. Some of them do not even agree that it happened. But the layers are there, the ash is there, the abandoned meals are there, and no single explanation accounts for all of them. These are the 15. To be clear about the ground rules before we start, no reputable institution has ever produced a peer-reviewed paper proving these 15 events happened in a literal, connected 7-day span. Ancient dating methods, even the best radiocarbon and dendrochronological techniques available today, generally carry margins of error measured in years or decades, not days. What follows is real archaeology, real excavation reports, and real, still debated scholarship about 15 settlements that share an unusually specific signature: sudden abandonment, minimal violence, and belongings left behind as if their owners expected to return and simply never did. The same weak framing is the mystery this video is built around, not a claim any of the archaeologists cited below have made themselves. Keep that in mind, and let the pattern speak for itself. Number 15. Skara Brae, Orkney, Scotland. Around 2500 BC, on a windswept spit of land on the northern edge of Europe, a woman kneels beside a stone dresser built directly into the wall of her house. On its shelves sit carved bone pins, a scattering of shells, and a small stone tool still gritty with use. She has not put them away for later. She has left them exactly where they sat the last time she touched them. The house has a stone hearth, a stone bed frame, a stone box believed to have held bait for fish traps, all of it built from flagstone because the treeless island offered nothing else. This is one of 10 houses connected by covered stone passageways at Skara Brae, one of the best preserved Neolithic villages on Earth, discovered only because a storm in 1850 ripped the grass from a sand dune and exposed the walls beneath. The site was occupied for roughly 6 centuries, and then, in a layer archaeologists can date to within a narrow window, it simply stops. No burned layer, no mass grave, no sign of violence. The pins are still on the dresser. Some researchers have proposed a catastrophic sandstorm, sudden and complete, burying the village so fast that residents had no time to gather belongings, only time to run. Others argue for a slower environmental collapse, soil exhaustion, crop failure, a coastline reshaping itself under rising seas. What is not disputed is the strangeness of the abandonment itself, a community that appears to walk away from its own dinner table. The dresser survives. The people who filled it do not. Modern excavators, working under the direction of the University of the Highlands and Islands Archaeology Institute, have used ground-penetrating radar to confirm that the sand and shell-midden material sealing the site arrived in a single depositional event, rather than through decades of gradual dune migration, a finding that supports the catastrophic storm hypothesis over the slow decline theory that dominated earlier scholarship. Coastal erosion continues to eat away at the site today, meaning archaeologists are racing an ongoing version of the very process that may have ended it 5,000 years ago, one storm season at a time. Number 14. Cahokia, Illinois, North America. At its peak around 1100 AD, Cahokia was larger than London. Its central earthwork, Monk's Mound, rose 10 stories above the Mississippi floodplain, the largest pre-Columbian structure north of Mexico, built basket load by workers, who moved an estimated 55 million cubic feet of earth without a single wheeled cart or draft animal. Tens of thousands of people lived in its shadow. Then, within a compressed span that archaeologists studying soil cores and post-hole evidence have struggled to explain, the population collapses. Palisade walls are hastily reinforced, watchtowers go up, and then nothing. No successor city. No oral tradition among later Mississippian peoples that clearly names what happened at the mother settlement. Flood deposit layers suggest catastrophic Mississippi River flooding around the plausible collapse window, drowning the agricultural base that fed the city's enormous population. Climate researchers have also pointed to a period of severe drought stress on maize yields in the same era. Whichever mechanism triggered it, the abandonment reads less like decline and more like flight. Cahokia's plazas, capable of holding thousands for ceremony, stood empty within a lifetime. The mounds remain, the city they crowned does not. Researchers at Washington University in St. Louis, who have spent decades running soil core surveys across the Cahokia floodplain, note something else unusual in the final occupation layer: an apparent surge in construction of defensive palisades directly preceding the abandonment, followed immediately by evidence that those same defenses were never actually tested in combat. Whatever the people of Cahokia feared enough to build a wall against, it does not appear to have been an enemy army. It appears instead to have been something they could not build a wall against at all. Number 13, Great Zimbabwe, Southern Africa. Its walls rise 32 feet without mortar, granite blocks fitted so precisely that a knife blade cannot slide between them, enclosing a conical stone tower that still baffles engineers studying how Iron Age builders achieved the tolerances. At its height in the 1300s and 1400s, Great Zimbabwe was the political and trading capital of a kingdom that moved gold and ivory as far as China, evidenced by Chinese porcelain shards recovered from its middens. Then, in the archaeological horizon that Portuguese and later British excavators struggled to date precisely, the great enclosure empties. Cattle crawls fall silent. The soapstone birds that once crowned its walls, sacred enough that colonial-era looters scattered them across the world, are left behind rather than carried off by their own people, a detail archaeologists consider significant because portable sacred objects are almost always the first things a fleeing population saves. Proposed explanations range from soil and pasture exhaustion after 2 centuries of dense population pressure, to a shift in trade routes that starved the city of the gold traffic it depended on, to climatic drying documented in regional sediment cores. No single cause has been proven. What the evidence agrees on is the speed. Structures built to last centuries were used for barely one before the last hearth fire in the great enclosure went cold. Oral histories collected among Shona-speaking communities in the region describe the final rulers of Great Zimbabwe leading a deliberate planned migration northward rather than fleeing in disorder, a tradition that broadly aligns with the emergence of the successor Matapa state in the same period. But even a planned departure does not fully explain why builders capable of dry stone construction unmatched anywhere else in Iron Age Africa never again attempted a structure on that scale, at that site, at any point afterward. Whatever drove them out apparently convinced them never to come back. Number 12, Angkor, Cambodia. At its height, Angkor was the largest pre-industrial city on the planet, sprawling across roughly 1,000 square kilometers. Its temples fed by a hydraulic engineering system of reservoirs and canals so sophisticated that some modern hydrologists have called it more complex than anything built in Europe until the modern era. Angkor Wat alone required an estimated 300,000 workers and 6,000 elephants during construction. Then, in the 1400s, the Khmer court relocates to Phnom Penh, and within a compressed period, the Great Water Network silently fails. Sediment cores from the moats show alternating catastrophic monsoon flooding and multi-year droughts striking in rapid succession, evidence that the hydraulic system, engineered for a stable monsoon pattern, could not survive a suddenly unstable one. Canals silt over, reservoirs breach, the jungle, which had been held back for 4 centuries by an army of laborers maintaining the waterways, reclaims the temples within 2 human generations. French naturalist Henri Mouhot, who rediscovered Angkor for the West in 1860, described walking through temple corridors where tree roots had grown directly through carved sandstone doorframes, a detail confirmed by every subsequent excavation team. A city built to outlast empires could not survive the week. Its water stopped moving the way its engineers assumed it always would. Researchers with the Greater Angkor Project, a long-running collaboration between the University of Sydney and Cambodian heritage authorities using LiDAR to map the city's true extent beneath the jungle canopy, have identified evidence of hasty, unfinished repair work on several major canal embankments, patches begun and then simply abandoned mid-construction. It is the same signature found again and again across this list. Not a city that gave up, but a city that ran out of time to finish saving itself. Number 11, Nan Madol, Pohnpei, Micronesia. 982 artificial islets built from columnar basalt logs, some weighing up to 50 tons, stacked log cabin style, across a coral reef in the middle of the Pacific, connected by a network of tidal canals that led islanders to call it the Venice of the Pacific centuries before any European saw it. No quarry capable of producing that basalt exists anywhere near Nan Madol. Geologists have traced the stone to volcanic outcrops on the opposite side of the island, meaning every log was somehow transported by sea, a feat oral tradition attributes to sorcery and modern engineers attribute to bamboo rafts and an enormous sustained labor force. The Çatalhöyük dynasty ruled from Nan Madol for roughly 1,000 years. Then, in a transition period, local oral history preserves as sudden and violent, tied to the legendary warrior Helike arriving from Kosrae, the ruling seat empties. Unlike most of the sites on this list, Nan Madol's ending has a named story attached to it, but archaeology complicates the legend. Excavation shows the final occupation layers ending abruptly across multiple islets simultaneously, not gradually as a single conquest narrative would predict, and coincides with a documented Pacific-wide climate disruption that stressed food systems on multiple islands at once. The canals, once busy with canoe traffic between islets, silted into mangrove swamp within a few generations of the final layer. What makes Nan Madol especially difficult to explain away as simple conquest is the sheer physical effort embedded in its abandonment. A society capable of organizing the transport and stacking of tens of thousands of tons of basalt across open water did not lack the manpower to defend or rebuild a single royal seat, had defense been the only problem. Something about the final years at Nan Madol appears to have made the site itself, not just its rulers, undesirable to occupy. And Pohnpeian oral tradition to this day treats the ruins with a wariness closer to reverence for the dead than pride in ancestral achievement. Number 10. Thonis-Heracleion, Egypt, for centuries. Thonis-Heracleion existed only in the accounts of Herodotus and in inscriptions on a stone slab, a great port city at the mouth of the Nile where Paris and Helen supposedly took refuge before the Trojan War. Historians largely assumed it was legend or, at best, a poetic name for a district of Alexandria, until French underwater archaeologist Franck Gaudiot located it in the year 2000, submerged more than 30 feet beneath Abu Qir Bay. What his team found was not a city that decayed slowly into the sea. Colossal granite statues lie toppled in the exact same fallen orientation. Temple walls are sheared rather than eroded, and household items sit undisturbed on the seabed, exactly as if the ground had simply opened beneath the city in a single catastrophic event. Geological analysis of the site points to a combination of soil liquefaction, likely triggered by a sudden seismic event, and a land subsidence process that modern sediment modeling suggests could have dropped sections of the city meters below sea level within an alarmingly short window rather than across centuries. Ceramic and coin evidence brackets the final active occupation layer to a startlingly narrow band. A city that thrived for 1,000 years and hosted pharaohs did not fade from history. The ground underneath it appears to have simply given way. Gaudiot's team recovered more than 60 shipwrecks scattered across the submerged city, many still loaded with cargo, alongside 700-plus anchors, evidence of a working port frozen mid-operation rather than gradually decommissioned. Coins minted under Ptolemaic rulers were found alongside far older Pharaonic-era artifacts in the same collapsed layer, meaning the final catastrophic event struck a city that had already been continuously inhabited for the better part of a millennium, ending in what the site's own excavators have publicly described as a matter of a single geological moment rather than a gradual retreat from the sea. Number 9. Helike, Greece. In the winter of 373 BC, according to the Greek historian and geographer Strabo, the city of Helike, a prosperous member of the Achaean League on the Gulf of Corinth, was struck by a violent earthquake in the night and swallowed by the sea before dawn. Ancient writers describe sailors for generations afterward reporting a submerged bronze statue of Poseidon visible through clear water, its trident still raised, snagging their fishing nets from below. For centuries, this was treated as myth. Then in 2001, a Greek-American research team led by geologist Dora Katsonopoulou located the actual site, not underwater as legend insisted, but buried under a coastal lagoon that had shifted its position over 2 millennia. Excavated house floors show pottery still stacked for use, coins scattered as if dropped mid-transaction, and a skeleton found beneath collapsed roofing rather than in a burial context, a detail that confirms sudden structural failure rather than gradual decline. Geologists studying the fault line beneath the Gulf have confirmed it is capable of producing exactly the kind of catastrophic, near-instantaneous liquefaction event ancient sources describe. Helike did not decline over decades. By every physical and textual account available, it existed on one night and was gone by the next morning. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, writing centuries after the event, recorded a detail that unsettled ancient audiences as much as the earthquake itself, that in the months before Helike's destruction, its residents were reported to have driven out a group of refugees who had sought sanctuary at the city's temple of Poseidon, a violation of sacred hospitality that later Greek writers treated as the moral cause of the disaster, whether or not any modern geologist would accept the connection. Whatever the true trigger, ancient Greeks across the region treated Helike's sudden disappearance not as a natural event alone, but as a warning. Number 8. Chaco Canyon, New Mexico, North America. Pueblo Bonito, the great house at the heart of Chaco Canyon, contains roughly 600 rooms across 4 or 5 stories, aligned with such precision to solar and lunar cycles that modern archaeoastronomers still use it to study ancestral Puebloan cosmology. Timber for its construction, more than 200,000 trees by some estimates, was hauled from mountain ranges over 50 miles away, an extraordinary logistical undertaking for a society without draft animals or the wheel. For roughly 3 centuries, Chaco functioned as the ceremonial and administrative center of a network stretching across the Four Corners region. Then, in the archaeological horizon, dated by tree ring analysis to the mid-1100s, construction stops mid-project. Timber stockpiled for unfinished additions is left untouched. Tree ring records from the region show this window overlapping with one of the most severe and sustained droughts documented in the Southwest's climate history, a 50-year dry period that would have devastated the canyon's already marginal agriculture. But the speed of the final abandonment, evidenced by ceremonial items left in place rather than removed, has led some researchers to argue that drought alone does not explain it, pointing instead to social and religious upheaval compounding the environmental stress. Descendant Puebloan communities today maintain that their ancestors did not vanish but migrated with intention, carrying their ceremonial knowledge onward. The buildings, left mid-construction, tell a story of a departure that came faster than anyone building them expected. Dendrochronologist Jeffrey Dean's tree ring work, cross-referenced against Chaco's known construction timeline, shows that building activity across the canyon had already been slowing for roughly 2 decades before the final collapse, meaning the drought alone had been pressuring the system for a generation before whatever happened in the final years happened. That makes the sudden, near-total nature of the last abandonment even harder to explain through climate stress alone, and is part of why some archaeologists now favor an additional social collapse model, in which a slow-building crisis of political or religious legitimacy finally broke all at once. Number 7. Tanis, Egypt. For nearly 3,000 years, the city of Tanis sat lost beneath Nile Delta silt so completely that early explorers, including Napoleon's expedition scholars, initially misidentified its ruins as the biblical city of Pi-Ramesses, a confusion that took modern excavation nearly 2 centuries to fully untangle. Tanis served as a royal capital during Egypt's 21st and 22nd dynasties, and its royal necropolis, discovered by French Egyptologist Pierre Montet in 1939, contained silver coffins and gold funerary masks of a richness rivaling Tutankhamun's tomb, a discovery that made almost no international headlines because it was announced the same week the Second World War began in Europe. What makes Tanis relevant here is not its treasure but its geography. The branch of the Nile that fed the city, the Tanitic branch, is now almost entirely dry. Its channel shifted eastward over time. Sediment studies indicate this shift, and the resulting collapse of the city's agricultural and trade base occurred over a compressed period rather than the multi-century drift long assumed, likely triggered by a combination of tectonic subsidence in the delta and a major flood event that permanently rerouted the river's flow. A capital city, entirely dependent on a river channel for its existence, watched that channel abandon it, and had no way to follow. Montet's excavation notes, later reviewed extensively by Egyptologist Jean Yoyat, describe finding entire storage magazines still packed with grain and sealed amphorae, provisions clearly intended for continued use rather than final consumption, alongside administrative seals whose dates cluster tightly rather than spreading across a long decline. For a delta capital that had weathered dynastic turnover, foreign invasion, and civil war across 3,000 years of continuous occupation, it was not politics that finally emptied Tanis. It was a river that simply stopped showing up. Number 6. La Ciudad Perdida, Colombia, South America. Hidden in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta and rediscovered only in 1972 by looters searching for gold, La Ciudad Perdida, the Lost City, predates Machu Picchu by roughly 600 years. Built by the Tairona people, beginning around 800 AD, its terraces, staircases, and circular plazas were carved directly into the mountainside, connected by stone paths that still challenge modern hikers on the multi-day trek required to reach the site. At its height, the Tairona Confederation controlled trade routes stretching to the Caribbean coast. Then, in the period following Spanish contact in the 1500s, the city's terraces empty with a speed that colonial-era accounts do not fully explain. Spanish chroniclers describe Tairona resistance to conquest as fierce, and skeletal evidence from the region shows the telltale markers of introduced European diseases sweeping through indigenous populations who had no immunity, a pattern documented across the Americas in this same general era. But local Kogi descendants, who consider themselves direct spiritual heirs of the Tairona and still make pilgrimages to the site, maintain an oral tradition that the final abandonment was an intentional retreat deeper into the mountains to preserve sacred knowledge from outsiders, not simple destruction. Whichever account is closer to true, the terraces, engineered to hold a thriving population for centuries, were reclaimed by cloud forest within a remarkably narrow window, and were not seen by outside eyes again for roughly 400 years. Colombian archaeologist Santiago Giraldo, who has led excavation work at the site for the Global Heritage Fund, has pointed out that the terrace system shows no evidence of the deliberate destruction typically associated with conquest, no burned structures, no smashed ceremonial objects, only a clean cessation of maintenance on infrastructure that required constant upkeep to survive the region's heavy rainfall. Within roughly 2 generations of that maintenance stopping, cloud forest had swallowed staircases that had stood in daily use for 700 years. Number 5. Amarna, Egypt. In 1346 BC, the pharaoh Akhenaten did something no Egyptian ruler had done before. He abandoned the old gods, elevated the sun disk Aten as the sole divine power, and built an entirely new capital city from bare desert to house his revolution, naming it Akhenaten, known today as Amarna. Within a few short years, an entire city rose, complete with palaces, temples open to the sky, in a radical break from traditional enclosed sanctuaries, and workers' villages, whose skeletal remains, studied extensively by modern bioarchaeologists, show signs of severe physical strain from the breakneck pace of construction. Then, Akhenaten died, and within a compressed window that Egyptologists have narrowed using ceramic and administrative seal evidence, the entire city was abandoned. His successors, moving with what many historians read as active hostility toward his legacy, relocated the capital back to Thebes and Memphis, and began systematically chiseling Akhenaten's name from monuments across Egypt in an erasure campaign so thorough that Amarna itself was largely unknown to history until its rediscovery in the 1800s. Unlike most sites on this list, Amarna's ending has a clear political motive attached. But the speed remains striking. A capital built in roughly 5 years was fully emptied in perhaps 2, its temples dismantled for building stone elsewhere, its royal tomb left unfinished, and its residents scattered so completely that even Akhenaten's own mummy remains disputed among competing identifications to this day. Excavations led by the Egypt Exploration Society at Amarna's workers' village have uncovered bakeries with bread still in the ovens and workshops, with tools left mid-task, a level of preservation typically associated with sites destroyed by sudden disaster rather than orderly relocation, combined with administrative records showing royal messengers still being dispatched from the city in what appear to be its final active weeks. The picture that emerges is not of a slow political wind down, but of a bureaucracy still functioning right up until the order came to leave, and leave for good. Number 4. Çatalhöyük, Anatolia, Turkey. One of the earliest large agricultural settlements ever excavated, Çatalhöyük has no streets. Its houses, built of mud brick and packed edge to edge like cells in a honeycomb, could only be entered through holes in the roof. Residents climbing down interior ladders past walls painted with vultures, leopards, and hunting scenes, and floors that in several cases conceal the plastered skulls of ancestors buried directly beneath where the living slept. At its peak around 7000 BC, it may have housed as many as 8,000 people, remarkable for a settlement roughly 4,000 years before the invention of writing. Excavation, directed for decades by archaeologist Ian Hodder, has revealed that individual houses were rebuilt on the exact same footprint for as many as 18 generations, a continuity of place so deliberate it borders on ritual. And then, in the horizon dated to roughly 5700 BC, the practice stops. Houses are not rebuilt. Residents relocate to smaller, more dispersed settlements nearby, abandoning the honeycomb city model entirely within what stratigraphic layering suggests was a startlingly compressed span. Climate researchers point to a documented period of regional aridification, stressing the wetland resources the settlement depended on. But archaeologists studying the shift note something else: the elaborate symbolic behavior, the wall paintings, the skull burials, fades from the record before the population itself does, suggesting the social fabric that held Çatalhöyük together may have unraveled before the physical village did. Isotope analysis of skeletal remains from the site's final occupation phases, conducted by bioarchaeologists working with Hodder's team, shows a measurable decline in overall nutrition and a rise in evidence of interpersonal violence compared to earlier centuries of habitation, a pattern more consistent with a community under mounting internal strain than one driven out solely by an external climate shock. By the time the last house on the honeycomb footprint was abandoned rather than rebuilt, the ritual practices that had defined the settlement for 4,000 years had already quietly disappeared from the archaeological record. Number 3. Dwarka, Gujarat, India. According to Hindu tradition preserved in the Mahabharata and the Puranas, Dwarka was the golden capital city of Krishna, built with divine assistance and swallowed by the sea within days of his death, a myth largely dismissed by Western scholarship for centuries. Then, beginning in the 1980s, marine archaeologists from India's National Institute of Oceanography, led by researcher S.R. Rao, conducted underwater surveys off the modern coastal town of Dwarka and identified stone structures, fortification walls, and pottery consistent with a substantial settlement, submerged offshore, dated by some researchers to as early as 1500 BC, though the dating and even the identification of the site remain genuinely contested within the archaeological community. What is not contested is that the Gujarat coastline in this region has experienced documented dramatic sea level and coastal erosion events, and that a settlement located precisely where oral tradition insists a submerged golden city should be does in fact sit underwater today. Whether Dwarka represents a literal city lost to sudden coastal collapse, a composite memory of several coastal settlement losses across centuries, or something closer to pure legend, remains an open question that Indian marine archaeology continues to actively investigate. It is included here not as settled fact, but as the rare case where an oral tradition insisting they vanished in days has, decades later, led researchers directly to physical ruins sitting exactly where the story said they would be. India's Archaeological Survey has continued periodic underwater survey work at the site into the 2020s, and while peer-reviewed consensus on the age and identity of the submerged structures remains unsettled, the surveys have consistently confirmed the presence of a genuine, substantial man-made settlement now lying beneath water that was, by all coastal geological modeling, dry land within human memory of the region's oldest continuous inhabitants. Number 2. Shangdu, Inner Mongolia, China. Known to the west through Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poems Xanadu, Shangdu was the summer capital of Kublai Khan, described by the Venetian merchant Marco Polo as a marble palace surrounded by a 16-mile wall enclosing parkland, fountains, and a bamboo pavilion so cleverly engineered it could be disassembled and moved. At its height in the late 1200s, Shangdu functioned as the ceremonial heart of the Yuan dynasty for half the year, hosting Kublai Khan's court in a display of Mongol-Chinese imperial fusion unmatched anywhere else in the empire. Then, in 1369, Ming dynasty forces overthrowing the Yuan captured and burned the city in a single documented military campaign, and ending with a clear historical cause, unlike most sites on this list. What makes Shangdu relevant to the larger pattern is the totality of the aftermath. Unlike most conquered capitals, which are reoccupied or repurposed by the victors, Shangdu was deliberately left in ruins as a political statement, its stones scavenged by local herders for centuries, its exact location eventually lost to all but local memory until Japanese archaeologists rediscovered and mapped it in the 1930s. A city built to project the permanence of an empire that believed it would rule forever was reduced, by deliberate decision rather than accident, to grazing land within a single generation. Chinese archaeological surveys conducted since Shangdu's designation as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2012 have mapped the full extent of the palace foundations, park walls, and canal systems Marco Polo described, confirming his account was not the exaggeration many Western historians once assumed. What the surveys also confirm is the totality of the Ming-era erasure. Unlike Rome absorbing conquered capitals into its own infrastructure, or the Mongols themselves reusing captured cities elsewhere in their empire, Shangdu's stones were deliberately never repurposed into any successor structure, a silence in the archaeological record that historians read as a message aimed squarely at anyone who might have dreamed of rebuilding it. Number 1. Roanoke, North Carolina, North America. In 1587, 115 English colonists, including a newborn girl named Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas, established a settlement on Roanoke Island under Governor John White. White sailed back to England for supplies, delayed for 3 years by war with Spain that grounded English shipping. When he finally returned in 1590, he found the settlement's palisade dismantled, houses gone, and the colonists themselves nowhere to be found. No bodies, no signs of battle, no graves. The only clue was a single word carved into a post, Croquan, the name of a nearby island and allied indigenous nation, with no accompanying distress mark that the colonists had prearranged to signal danger. Modern archaeological and genetic research, including work by the Croatoan Archaeological Society and DNA studies of families on nearby Hatteras Island, suggests the most likely explanation is not disappearance at all, but assimilation. The colonists, facing starvation, likely relocated to live among the friendly Croatoan people, whose descendants carry surnames and, according to some genetic researchers, ancestry markers consistent with English colonial lineage to this day. If true, Roanoke's colonists did not vanish so much as choose survival over the myth that grew around them. But the myth persists precisely because the evidence at the site itself offers no closure. A fort dismantled with care rather than destroyed by violence, belongings largely absent rather than scattered in panic, and a single carved word that has generated more speculation than almost any other clue in American archaeology. The First Colony Foundation, an archaeological research group focused specifically on the Roanoke mystery, has spent years excavating both Roanoke Island and Hatteras Island, recovering English-made rings, gun parts, and a distinctive type of pottery known as borderware, at sites consistent with the colonists having lived, farmed, and traded peacefully among indigenous communities for years after 1590 rather than dying in the initial weeks after White's departure, as popular legend often assumes. If that reconstruction holds, Roanoke's colonists survived their disappearance. It was only the story told about them afterward that erased them completely. 15 settlements, 15 different mechanisms, a storm that buried Skara Brae's dresser before its owner could clear it. A flood that may have drowned Cahokia's fields faster than its granaries could compensate. A trade route that starved Great Zimbabwe. A hydraulic system that failed Angkor in the span of 2 bad monsoon seasons. A reef floor that gave way beneath Thonis-Heracleion in what geologists increasingly believe was a matter of hours, not centuries. What ties these 15 together is not proof of a single shared catastrophe. and no reputable archaeologist would claim these events are causally connected across oceans that took ancient peoples months or years to cross. What ties them together is something stranger: the fact that so many independent, unconnected civilizations, separated by thousands of miles and centuries of time, share this exact signature in the archaeological record. Not slow decline, not gradual migration, a door left open, a meal left on the table. A city that was there, and then, in the space of days rather than generations, was not. Archaeology is very good at explaining why civilizations decline. It is far less comfortable with the sites that refuse to decline politely, the ones that show every sign of health right up until the final layer, then stop. Every explanation offered here, from earthquakes to droughts to floods to conquest, is the best current evidence can support. But evidence has been wrong before, and every one of these 15 sites was at some point considered myth before it was found. Helike was a legend until 2001. Thonis-Heracleion was a footnote in Herodotus until the year 2000. Dwarka was scripture until marine surveys began mapping stone beneath the waves off Gujarat. Skara Brae did not exist, as far as the historical record was concerned, until a single storm in 1850 tore the answer directly out of a sand dune. Every generation assumes it has found the last of these places. Every generation so far has been wrong. What should unsettle you is not any single site on this list. It is the shape all 15 make together. A dresser left stocked, a grain store left sealed, a bakery left with bread still in the oven, a fort dismantled with care rather than burned. These are not the marks of civilizations that ran out of time to plan an evacuation. They are the marks of civilizations that had time to plan one, and chose, again and again, across 3 continents and 5,000 years, to leave almost everything behind anyway. Whatever they were running from, they judged their possessions not worth the delay of carrying them. If this journey through the village's history nearly erased made you look at an abandoned ruin a little differently, drop a comment with the vanished place that unsettled you the most, and let us know which of these 15 you think deserves its own full episode. And subscribe for more of the disappearances history has never fully explained.